It started with a stare that shattered the monotony of my morning, a look so unnerving that I couldn't ignore it, even for a second. I had barely opened my eyes when I noticed Max, my golden retriever, fixed in place. His head was low, eyes glued to the far corner of my small room, as if he were locked in a silent, desperate conversation with something unseen. I sat up abruptly, heart thundering, as a cold shiver snaked its way down my spine. I'm not one to jump at shadows or fleeting impressions. After all, I'd lived alone in this modest apartment for years, comfortable in the quiet routine of my life. The room I shared with Max was simple, a haven of well-worn furniture, half-faded posters on the walls, and a scattering of memories that told stories of laughter and loss. But that morning, every familiar detail seemed suddenly foreign. The usual morning light, filtering softly through the thin curtains, felt harsh and accusatory, throwing deep shadows into corners that had never before seemed so dark. Max's unblinking gaze was magnetic, impossible to look away from. I pushed aside the grogginess and approached slowly, my footsteps tentative on the creaking wooden floor. Every small sound in the silence of dawn, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rustle of the wind outside, seemed amplified. When I neared the corner where Max stared, I felt an inexplicable weight, as though the very air was charged with secrets. There was nothing there, just a bare, peeling patch of wallpaper and the faint outline of a crevice in the wall. And yet, in that empty space, I began to perceive shapes, a blur of dark lines and sudden angles that made my skin crawl. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that fatigue was playing tricks on me. But the unsettling image persisted. Max's eyes never wavered, they were locked on the spot as if he recognized something I couldn't see. I called softly to him, "Max, come here, boy," but he didn't budge. The silence that followed was suffocating. In that moment, the boundary between the safe world I knew and the unknown was razor thin. I left the room and moved to the small hallway that connected it to the rest of the apartment. The transition from the cramped, personal space of my bedroom to the broader, yet still intimate corridor, felt like stepping from a shadow into a glaring light. I paused in the hallway, listening for any sound of disturbance, a creak, a murmur, but all I heard was the steady, measured rhythm of my heartbeat. Yet something in the back of my mind insisted that I hadn't seen everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that the anomaly in my room was just the first ripple of something far more disturbing. Returning to my room, I found Max still where he was, his gaze unwavering, his tail stiff against the backdrop of early morning light. I sank onto the edge of my unmade bed, trying to piece together the fragments of rational thought. Had I imagined the shapes in the wall? Was my mind playing tricks on me? The answer eluded me, but one thing was clear, Max's behavior was anything but ordinary. His eyes were dark pools of raw emotion, fear, or perhaps something more instinctual, and they stirred in me an alarm I had never felt before. I decided to distract myself with the normalcy of breakfast. In the cramped, utilitarian kitchen, I fumbled with the coffee machine, my hands trembling slightly as I ground the beans and filled the water reservoir. The sound of the grinder was loud in the quiet space, each rotation echoing my escalating anxiety. I made my coffee, its bitter aroma mixing with the lingering unease. As I sipped the steaming brew, I stared blankly out the small window above the sink. The view was unremarkable, a sliver of the brick exterior of our aging building, a patch of sky streaked with the soft blush of dawn, and a few haphazardly planted trees swaying in a gentle breeze. Yet, within that familiar scene, I couldn't help but feel that the tranquility was a fragile veneer covering something disturbing. I tried to convince myself that the whole episode was nothing more than a trick of the light and my own overactive imagination. But as I returned to the room, the oppressive tension was palpable. Max continued his vigil by the corner, as if standing guard over an unspeakable truth. I knelt down beside him, reaching out a tentative hand to touch his warm fur. The closeness of his body offered a small measure of comfort, but the intensity of his stare pulled my eyes back to the corner. There, in the interplay of light and shadow, was that elusive hint of form again, a suggestion of something that shouldn't be there. In a desperate bid to reclaim some control over my spiraling thoughts, I decided to call a friend, someone who could offer a different perspective on the situation. I dialed Sarah's number, her soothing voice often a balm for my frazzled nerves. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," I whispered when she answered. I described the unsettling tableau, the fixed stare, the inexplicable shape in the corner, the silent, ominous atmosphere that had enveloped my apartment. There was a pause on the other end before she said, "Maybe it's just your imagination running wild. You know how these quiet mornings can play tricks on you." Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they only deepened my sense of isolation. If even Sarah, who had seen me at my worst, couldn't understand the gravity of the moment, then perhaps I was truly alone with something I couldn't explain. After the call, I decided to step outside for a walk, seeking the clarity of the bustling streets beyond my building. The neighborhood was a small, tightly knit community, where every face was familiar and every routine predictable. I walked along the cracked sidewalks, past rows of modest houses and neatly kept gardens, trying to dispel the dread that clung to me like a second skin. Yet the images of that dark corner and Max's unwavering gaze haunted me, echoing in every step I took. Passing by a nearby park, I couldn't help but glance at the weathered bench where I used to sit for quiet moments of reflection. Now, the bench appeared ominous, shrouded in shadows despite the early morning sun. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the world had subtly tilted on its axis and that I was standing at the precipice of an inexplicable mystery. In the park, the usual sounds of life, the distant laughter of children, the rhythmic tapping of a jogger's footsteps seemed unnervingly distorted, as if filtered through a lens of unease. When I finally returned home, dusk was beginning to settle. The apartment, which had felt almost like a sanctuary earlier in the day, now exuded a stifling tension. The transition from daylight to the murk of evening was always a quiet affair, but tonight it felt charged with latent menace. In the fading light, every crevice and shadow in the room seemed to pulse with an unspoken warning. Max greeted me at the door, his eye still fixed on that same corner, as if daring me to acknowledge the unsettling truth he had uncovered. I sat down on the threadbare rug in the center of the room, trying to steady my nerves with the simplicity of the moment. The room was filled with relics of a life lived in routine, a well-worn armchair by the window, a scattering of old books on the coffee table, and a single framed photo of happier times. But all of these familiar objects now served as stark contrasts to the eerie presence that lurked in the far corner. The juxtaposition of normalcy and the disturbing unknown was as jarring as it was inexplicable. As the night deepened, I found myself wrestling with an internal tempest of conflicting emotions. Rationality battled with primal instinct. The more I tried to dismiss the anomaly as a mere trick of the mind, the more it loomed, insistent and unyielding. Max's stare became a silent testimony to something that defied explanation, a presence that was both unnervingly close and yet impossibly intangible. I lay awake on the creaking floor, the ambient sounds of the apartment weaving into a dissonant lullaby that amplified my fears. Every rustle of fabric, every distant creak of the building, transformed into a potential harbinger of the unknown. The unsettling atmosphere of that night wasn't confined to my apartment alone, it seeped into the very fabric of my existence. Even the smallest details, a clock ticking relentlessly on the wall, the quiet hum of a distant street lamp, seemed to conspire in a symphony of dread. The room, the hallway, the park, and the fleeting glimpse of the street outside formed a quartet of spaces, each more familiar than the last, yet each now tainted by an undercurrent of disquiet. By the time I finally surrendered to a restless sleep, I was left with a gnawing certainty that something had irrevocably changed. The mundane routine of my life had been disrupted by an event so subtle, yet so deeply unsettling, that it threatened to unmoor the very foundations of my reality. And as I drifted into a troubled slumber, I couldn't shake the image of Max's unblinking eyes, forever fixed on that dark corner, eyes that seemed to say that the truth was far more complex and far more disturbing than I had ever dared to imagine. The morning after that unsettling night arrived with a sluggish reluctance, as if the day itself mourned the events that had unfolded. I awoke to a heavy silence that blanketed the apartment, a silence that had replaced even the familiar hum of routine. The lingering dread from the previous night was like an unwelcome shadow, stretching itself across every surface of my mind. I lay in bed for a long time, replaying the image of Max's fixed gaze and the inexplicable shape in the corner, It was as though the memory had etched itself into every crevice of my thoughts, refusing to fade with the passing hours. Dragging myself out of bed, I tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling with the promise of a busy day. I went about the motions of preparing breakfast again, but the mundane act of cracking eggs into a sizzling pan felt more like a distraction than a comfort. Even the ritual of boiling water for tea couldn't dissolve the tension that gripped me. The apartment, usually a safe haven, had transformed into a stage for my mounting anxiety. Every familiar corner and crevice seemed loaded with potential secrets, each one whispering caution in a language I couldn't quite decipher. Max, ever the silent sentinel, was once again stationed by the same corner. His posture was different this time, more alert, as if he were bracing himself for something. I couldn't help but wonder if he was guarding me from an unseen danger, or if his fixation was a silent protest against a reality that had suddenly shifted. As I approached him, he lifted his head slightly, his eyes tracking me with an intensity that unsettled me further. I attempted to soothe him with gentle strokes, but his focus remained unbroken, his body tense and unyielding. That day, I resolved to uncover even the smallest clue as to what was happening. I meticulously inspected every inch of the corner, examining the peeling wallpaper, running my fingers along the rough surface of the crevice, searching for any sign of a hidden object or message. Yet, the space revealed nothing more than the remnants of wear and age, its darkness offering no answers. The absence of any tangible evidence only deepened my internal disquiet. The invisible barrier between normalcy and the inexplicable was growing ever more opaque. Unable to shake the unease, I stepped out for another walk, this time determined to clear my head and reconnect with the familiar rhythm of everyday life. The streets were unusually quiet, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. I passed by the same park where I had once found solace on sunny afternoons. Now, however, even the park's gentle ambience was marred by an undercurrent of foreboding. The rustling leaves and distant laughter felt muffled, as though the world had adjusted its volume to a lower, more cautious tone. In a moment of fragile optimism, I decided to visit a small local cafe, a place where the aroma of fresh coffee and the low hum of conversation usually grounded me in reality. The cozy interior, with its mismatched chairs and warm lighting, had always been a refuge from life's occasional storms. Today, however, as I sipped my latte, my thoughts kept straying back to the apartment. Every clink of a cup, every murmur from the counter, seemed to punctuate the silence of my worries. I recalled Sarah's hesitant reassurances and felt a pang of isolation, as though even the voices of those I trusted could not penetrate the heavy veil that now enshrouded my life. Returning home as twilight began to seep into the sky, I half expected a change, a shift in the atmosphere that might explain the previous night's disturbing events. But the apartment remained unchanged in its silent vigil. Max was once again in position, his presence a constant reminder of the lingering unknown. The interplay of dusk and shadow in the room created an eerie tableau, the soft glow of the street lamp outside mingled with the deepening gloom inside, and that same corner seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm. I tried to convince myself that it was merely the trick of light and shadow, a mundane play of nature. Yet, the steady intensity of Max's stare defied any such rationalization. As night fell, I attempted to resume a semblance of normalcy. I sat down with a book, hoping that the familiar cadence of printed words would anchor me to reality. But every time my eyes flicked up, they found themselves drawn to the dark corner as if pulled by an unseen magnet. The words on the page began to blur, merging with my mounting anxiety until the distinction between fiction and reality dissolved. The once comforting narratives of everyday life now felt like fragile constructs, vulnerable to the encroachment of something far more disconcerting. Sleep, which I so desperately needed, remained elusive. The hours crawled by in a series of restless moments, punctuated by the unyielding presence of Max's vigil and the relentless murmur of my own thoughts. Every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of the wind outside, was a reminder that the normalcy I so cherished was slipping away, replaced by an insidious, creeping dread. I found myself staring into the darkness, trying to decipher shapes that danced on the edge of perception, and wondering if the night itself had become a canvas for the inexplicable. In that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, the boundary between reality and nightmare thinned to a near transparency. My mind raced with thoughts that were both mundane and surreal. Memories of a childhood spent in a safe, unchanging world collided with the raw, unsettling impressions of the current moment. I questioned whether I was merely a spectator in a personal drama unfolding around me, or if I had unwittingly become entangled in a mystery that defied explanation. Even as the hours passed, the apartment seemed to pulse with a hidden life. Shadows moved in a rhythm that was both hypnotic and menacing, and I began to wonder if Max's unwavering gaze was the only truth in a space filled with false impressions. I recalled an old adage from a friend long gone, a saying about how the eyes of a loyal companion could perceive what human senses overlooked. Now, that idea loomed large in my mind, its implications chilling me to the core. Was it possible that Max's connection to the unknown was more than a simple quirk, but rather an instinctual recognition of a truth that eluded my understanding? The night wore on, and as I finally sank into a fitful sleep, my dreams were a turbulent mix of reality and abstract terror. I dreamt of that corner, of walls that whispered secrets in a language I couldn't comprehend, and of Max, his eyes shining with an otherworldly light. In the dream, I followed him, wandering through a labyrinth of shifting rooms and endless corridors, each turn revealing fragments of a hidden history that spoke of both comfort and calamity. The intensity of the visions left me drenched in sweat and with a heart pounding as if it were trying to escape my chest. Dawn crept in slowly, ushering in a tentative hope that perhaps the night's terrors were confined to the realm of dreams. But as I awoke, the first beam of light falling upon the familiar walls of the apartment, a gnawing uncertainty lingered. The spectral images of the night had not vanished, they had merely found new places to hide. Max, now seemingly more subdued, regarded me with eyes that held both a quiet sorrow and an unspoken warning. I couldn't shake the impression that he knew more than I did, that the events of the previous night were just the beginning of an unfolding narrative that would reshape the very fabric of my existence. Sitting at the small table in the kitchen, I pondered my next steps. I considered researching similar occurrences, reading accounts of inexplicable experiences, or even reaching out to professionals who might have encountered something akin to what I was living. Yet every rational plan was quickly overpowered by a visceral urge to simply confront the mystery head-on. I resolved that day to explore every facet of my apartment anew, each room, each shadow, every insignificant detail, to uncover the hidden thread that connected the eerie occurrences to the life I once knew. In the quiet solitude of that morning, every step felt both courageous and dangerously naive. The day stretched before me like an open wound, raw, vulnerable, and pulsating with the promise of revelations that might bring both clarity and despair. I couldn't help but feel that the events swirling around me were a subtle, yet profound reminder of the fragility of our perceptions. The safe and predictable world I had constructed was disintegrating into something far more complex and unsettling. And as I set out to explore the remnants of what used to be my untroubled life, I couldn't escape the stark realization that sometimes, the truth reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent insistence of a dog's unwavering stare. Every detail of that day, every whispered echo in the hall, every tremor of apprehension in my chest, hinted at a deeper mystery waiting to be unraveled. I stepped into the unknown with a heavy heart and a mind teetering on the edge of reason, uncertain if I was chasing answers or merely confronting a reflection of my own inner turmoil. The delicate balance between normalcy and the inexplicable was shifting beneath my feet, and I knew, with a dread both thrilling and paralyzing, that I had only begun to scratch the surface of something far more profound and terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The day unfolded like a slow descent into a labyrinth of questions and half-formed answers. The unsettling tension that had gripped the apartment since that first night refused to relent, and with each passing hour, its hold grew stronger, as if the very walls were conspiring to keep its secret hidden. That morning, after a brief but feverish consultation with an acquaintance who specialized in home repairs, the narrator found himself grappling with more questions than answers. The expert had dismissed the wall's peculiar texture as mere age and wear, yet something about it stirred memories of unspoken warnings. The inspection had left him with a hollow sense of disquiet, a nagging feeling that the answers lay not in physical repairs, but in confronting the silent language of the space itself. In the small, cluttered living room that had once been a retreat for quiet evenings and gentle solitude, the light of late afternoon filtered through stained glass, casting a mosaic of fractured hues across the worn carpet. It was in this subtle interplay of brightness and shadow that the narrator began to notice new details, a faint residue along the base of the wall, barely perceptible in the shifting light, and a series of almost imperceptible scratches that marred the otherwise smooth surface. Each mark, he felt, was a punctuation in an unfinished sentence, a reminder of something deliberately obscured by time and neglect. Max, his faithful golden retriever, continued to be a silent witness to every unfolding moment. His eyes, dark and searching, seemed to hold secrets that the narrator could only glimpse in fleeting moments. Sitting on the floor beside the window, Max watched as if he were expecting an explanation from a long-forgotten conversation. The dog's unwavering focus, so different from his usual playful demeanor, now resonated like a persistent echo of warning. The narrator knelt beside him, placing a tentative hand on Max's head, and for a moment, their shared silence felt like a fragile truce against an encroaching storm. It was during this reflective pause that a sudden, almost imperceptible sound shattered the quiet, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the corner. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, yet it carried with it a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. The narrator's pulse quickened. He had become hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the atmosphere. He rose slowly, trying to keep his breathing steady as he moved toward the origin of the tapping. The sound led him back to the infamous corner, that same disconcerting patch of wall that had triggered his sleepless nights. Drawing closer, he could now detect a faint but deliberate pattern in the noise, a sequence that resembled the tapping of a keyboard or perhaps an ancient typewriter. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned in, squinting at the surface, searching for an explanation. Yet, there was nothing visibly amiss, no hidden compartment, no crack revealing a secret passage, only the unyielding face of old wallpaper and muted tones of decay. The narrator touched the wall with trembling fingers, feeling the texture beneath his skin, as if trying to decode the message it held. For a fleeting moment, the possibility that the sound might be generated by a malfunctioning appliance or the settling of the building crossed his mind. But deep down, he knew that this was something altogether different, a call from within the house itself, or perhaps from the memories of what it had witnessed over the years. Determined to confront this mystery, he retraced his steps to the only sanctuary left in his immediate grasp, the small cafe on the corner of the block. The cafe, with its warm, inviting aroma and the gentle murmur of conversation, had always been a refuge in times of uncertainty. Today, however, even its cozy corners and familiar faces seemed to carry the weight of the unanswered questions that haunted him. Settling into his usual seat by the window, he pulled out a notepad and began to write down every detail he could remember, from Max's unwavering gaze to the mysterious pattern of scratches on the wall. The act of writing, usually a cathartic release, now served as a means to capture fleeting fragments of an experience that defied logical explanation. In between scribbled notes, he found himself striking up quiet conversations with the cafe's regulars, a couple who ran a small bookshop next door, an elderly man who frequented the same corner table, and even the barista who had witnessed the narrator's anxious visits over the past few days. None of them could offer a concrete answer, but their own tales of strange occurrences in old buildings and the inexplicable behavior of pets added subtle layers to the mystery. Their stories, laced with cautionary wisdom and the kind of pragmatic resignation that comes from years of living with the inexplicable, only deepened his resolve to understand what was unfolding in his own home. Returning to the apartment as twilight fell, the narrator felt as though he were entering a stage set for an inevitable confrontation. The shift from the soft glow of the cafe to the stark, almost accusatory illumination of his living space was jarring. The room, with its familiar contours now transmuted by the encroaching darkness, seemed to pulse with a quiet urgency. The corner, that same immutable point of focus, now appeared even more prominent. Its presence was like a silent beacon drawing him into the depths of a mystery that had been simmering beneath the surface of everyday life. Max greeted him at the door, his eyes reflecting an intensity that bordered on the desperate. The dog's presence was no longer that of a mere pet, but of a vigilant guardian who had long sensed that something was amiss. The narrator's thoughts churned with conflicting emotions, fear, determination, and a deep-seated need to reclaim the safety of his home. He decided that this night, he would no longer be a passive observer. Instead, he would confront the anomaly head-on, armed with nothing more than his own resolve and a growing conviction that the truth was waiting just beyond the veil of the mundane. That evening, with a small flashlight in hand and a notebook tucked under his arm, he began a careful, deliberate examination of the apartment. Every step was measured, every movement purposeful. In the living room, the soft rustling of the curtains and the muted hum of the refrigerator formed a backdrop to his methodical search. He retraced his path along the wall, noting the precise locations of every scratch, every imperfection, as if they were clues in a puzzle that spanned decades. He pressed his ear against the wall, listening for the faint tapping that had haunted him earlier, a sound that now seemed like an encoded message, a Morse code of despair echoing from the depths of the past. In the dim light of the corridor, his eyes adjusted to the subtle shifts in color and texture. There, in the interplay of shadow and light, he began to perceive patterns that he had previously overlooked. Faint indentations and irregularities in the wallpaper hinted at a history of repairs, modifications, and perhaps, secrets that had been deliberately concealed. The very air in the apartment felt charged, as though the building itself was alive, holding its breath in anticipation of a revelation. With each discovery, his heart swelled with both trepidation and a strange exhilaration. This was no longer merely a matter of personal anxiety, it was a journey into the hidden layers of a place that had sheltered him for years. At one point, as he lingered near the corner, a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the soundscape caught his attention. The low tapping had resumed, more persistent and insistent than before, as though it were beckoning him to delve deeper. The sound was rhythmic, punctuating the silence like the ticking of an unseen clock. It was as if time itself were being measured in these subtle intervals, each tap a reminder of moments past and secrets left unspoken. In that charged moment, the narrator felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow the sound, to trace its origins to a source he could not yet comprehend. He moved toward the wall with renewed determination, his fingertips grazing the surface as if trying to feel the pulse of a hidden mechanism. The texture under his hand was unexpectedly warm, almost organic, a stark contrast to the cool, inanimate nature of aged plaster. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if the wall had ever been something more than a simple partition, if it had once been part of a living, breathing organism that had long since been forgotten. The thought was absurd, and yet it resonated with the kind of raw intensity that defied logical explanation. Outside, the city hummed with its own nocturnal rhythm. The distant sound of traffic, the occasional bark of a stray dog, and the murmur of voices from late-night conversations filtered in through a cracked window, merging with the apartment's internal symphony of suspense. In that interplay of external normalcy and internal anomaly, the narrator sensed a profound disjunction, a breach between the orderly world outside and the chaotic, enigmatic realm within his own home. As the night deepened, the tension reached a fevered pitch. The tapping became almost a mantra, a hypnotic cadence that echoed in the recesses of his mind. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by an unyielding vigilance that kept him tethered to the present moment. Every sound, every shadow, seemed imbued with a sense of urgency, as though the apartment itself were calling out for resolution. Max lay at his feet, restless and alert, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to materialize from the darkness. In a moment of quiet resolve, the narrator resolved to document every detail, every sensation, so that if he ever found himself questioned about these events, there would be a record, a testament to the subtle interplay between the ordinary and the inexplicable. He opened his notebook and began to write, the words flowing from his pen like a desperate confession. He described the warm texture of the wall, the rhythmic tapping that defied explanation, and the relentless intensity of Max's gaze. Each sentence was imbued with the raw emotion of a man who had crossed an invisible threshold, whose every sense had been heightened by the brush with an unknown truth. Outside the confines of his apartment, the familiar neighborhoods carried on with their quiet routines, unaware of the clandestine drama unfolding behind closed doors. Yet within the dim confines of that aging building, every crevice, every flickering shadow, whispered of secrets long buried. The narrator felt a kinship with the space, a sense of shared isolation and unspoken sorrow. It was as if the building itself bore the scars of countless untold stories, each one a silent testament to the passage of time and the inevitability of change. And so, with the night stretching endlessly before him, the narrator continued his exploration, a journey that was as much about unearthing the mysteries of his surroundings as it was about confronting the deep, unsettling truths that lay hidden within himself. The apartment, in its quiet defiance of normalcy, had become a mirror reflecting his own inner turmoil, the fear of the unknown, the pain of memories best left unexamined, and the desperate yearning for clarity in a world that had suddenly grown too vast and too strange. As the clock ticked on in the stillness of that oppressive night, the narrator felt a stirring of determination amidst the fear. He knew that tomorrow would bring new light, and perhaps new revelations. But for now, in the enveloping darkness of the present, he would remain vigilant, bound by an unspoken promise to uncover the truth behind the strange tapping, the mysterious marks on the wall, and the enduring, watchful eyes of his loyal companion. In the interplay of shadow and light, of sound and silence, he sensed that every unanswered question was a step toward understanding, however painful or profound that understanding might prove to be. The night's quiet persistence was a stark reminder that the mysteries of life do not always resolve themselves in neat, comforting narratives. Sometimes, they linger in the margins, in the half-seen movements of a dog's gaze or in the soft, deliberate tapping on an old wall. And in those moments, when the familiar dissolves into the strange, one is forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that reality is often a tapestry woven from both the mundane and the inexplicable. With each passing moment, the narrator steeled himself for what was to come, aware that the journey into the heart of this mystery was far from over, and that the next revelation might just be the one to shatter everything he thought he knew. Armed with a restless determination born of sleepless nights and mounting dread, he resolved that tonight would be the night to confront the mystery once and for all. The apartment, now steeped in the melancholy of years and the residue of unexplained happenings, awaited his careful investigation. As dusk surrendered to the heavy cloak of night, he gathered a modest toolkit, a flashlight, a putty knife, and a set of screwdrivers, and returned to the infamous corner. Max, his ever-watchful companion, padded silently at his heels, the dog's dark eyes reflecting both worry and a silent urging to uncover the truth. In the dim glow of the flashlight, the peeling wallpaper and the cracked plaster of that corner looked less like the casual signs of age and more like the fragile facade of a long-hidden secret. With trembling fingers, he pried at the loose edges of the wallpaper. The paper curled back reluctantly, revealing a narrow seam behind which the wall's true surface lay, a surface that was not as uniform as it had once appeared. The concrete, mottled with decades of neglect, bore subtle indentations and scratches that hinted at repeated tampering. There, in the interplay of light and shadow, was a small recessed area, almost as if the wall had been designed to conceal something. His heart hammered in his chest as he pressed the putty knife gently into the gap. A faint, irregular sound, neither the drip of water nor the scurry of rodents, resonated from behind the plaster. It was the same low, rhythmic tapping he had heard before, but now it seemed more deliberate, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment of exposure. Carefully, he continued to peel back more layers, each tug of the old paper a small battle against years of silence and neglect. The texture of the wall shifted from cold, hard concrete to something softer, almost organic. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he had stumbled upon a hidden chamber engineered by a past tenant desperate to leave a trace of a dark secret. At last, the last piece of the damaged wallpaper fell away to reveal a narrow recess barely large enough for a hand. In that cramped, dust-choked cavity lay an aged metal box, its surface rusted and pitted by time. The box was unremarkable in size, yet it seemed imbued with an eerie gravity, as if it had been forgotten deliberately. With a deep, steadying breath, he reached into the recess and retrieved the box. The weight of it, both physical and symbolic, was heavier than he expected. Max's soft whine of concern punctuated the silence as the box was brought into the harsh beam of his flashlight. He sat on the cool, concrete floor, the box resting on his knees. Its lid was secured with a small, tarnished lock, but the lock was brittle, likely a relic of a bygone era. With a twist of his wrist and a careful tap of the screwdriver, the lock surrendered, its mechanism grinding softly in protest. As the lid creaked open, the narrow beam of light revealed a collection of fragile artifacts, a bundle of yellowed letters tied together with a faded ribbon, a small, leather-bound diary whose cover was embossed with a name that he did not recognize, and a handful of old photographs, their edges curled and sepia-toned from decades of neglect. He picked up the diary first, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten entries that chronicled the life of a person whose existence had been marked by sorrow and regret. The words spoke of love lost and trust betrayed, of moments of fleeting happiness overshadowed by deep, unspoken pain. One entry, dated many years ago, recounted a tragic day when the writer, once a vibrant soul, had been forced to confront an unbearable betrayal that shattered a family. The entry ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought, leaving behind a trail of questions and a lingering sense of unfinished business. As he slowly turned the fragile pages, the truth began to crystallize. The diary belonged to a former tenant of the apartment, a person whose life had been intertwined with the very walls he now scrutinized. In the margins of several pages, faint notations hinted at clandestine meetings and quiet confrontations, all revolving around a single, recurring location in the apartment, the very corner that had become the center of his own torment. There, in a moment of desperate clarity, the writer had confessed that the corner had been witness to unspeakable sorrow, a silent repository for the echoes of a tragic past that the world had long since forgotten. The diary revealed a story of isolation and betrayal, a painful chronicle of personal loss that had transformed a once warm and loving home into a mausoleum of regret. A soft, tentative sound made him glance up. Max was no longer near his feet but had circled the room and was now standing before a large, faded photograph propped on a rickety shelf. The photograph, though blurred by time, depicted a group of people, a family, perhaps, smiling in a moment of captured happiness. But one face, obscured by a curtain of shadow, bore a striking resemblance to the writer of the diary. The connection was both inexplicable and undeniable, the same sorrowful eyes, the same burdened expression that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken tragedies. It was as if the corner had become a silent witness to the intergenerational pain, a marker where the memories of the past coalesced into a tangible presence that now affected the present. Tears welled in his eyes as he pieced together the fragments of the story. The rhythmic tapping he had heard for weeks was nothing more than the distant, irregular sound of an old building settling, a mundane yet persistent reminder of decay. But to him, in the charged atmosphere of that night, it had taken on a different meaning. It was the steady pulse of time, echoing the writer's heart, a heartbeat that refused to be silenced by the passage of years. Max, with his innate sensitivity, had been drawn to that corner long before the mystery became apparent to his human companion, his unwavering gaze an attempt to communicate the silent anguish embedded in the very fibers of the old walls. With the artifact spread before him, the weight of reality settled in, a reality that was far more painful and complex than any supernatural horror. The apartment, with its peeling walls and dim corridors, was not haunted by ghosts or inexplicable phenomena. Instead, it was burdened with the remnants of human frailty, a repository for secrets and sorrows that had seeped into the fabric of the building over decades. The truth was raw and unembellished. Lives had been lived here, marked by both light and darkness, and sometimes the residue of that lived experience could linger long after the voices had faded away. In that charged moment of revelation, he felt an unexpected kinship with the unknown writer, a kinship that spoke of shared pain and the inescapable passage of time. The diary, the letters, and the photographs were not artifacts of a malevolent force, but rather the delicate remnants of a life steeped in tragedy. The corner, far from being a portal to another realm, was merely a silent witness to events that had once shattered hearts and left indelible scars. The dog's persistent stare had been an instinctive reaction to the lingering energy of grief and despair, a signal that some truths, however painful, were impossible to ignore. As the night deepened into a profound stillness, he gathered the recovered artifacts and carefully closed the metal box, as if sealing away the painful memories of the past. He understood now that the mystery had never been about an external horror, but about the human capacity to hold on to sorrow long after the moment has passed. The secrets of the apartment were etched into its walls, whispered in the creaks of the floor and the soft echoes of the past, and they served as a stark reminder that the most haunting specters are often not supernatural at all. They are the unresolved, unspoken traumas of everyday life. In the quiet aftermath of his discovery, he felt a fragile sense of release mingled with an enduring melancholy. The process of uncovering the hidden truth had not banished his fear or the eerie tension that had gripped the apartment. Rather, it had transformed it into a somber acknowledgement of a shared human experience, a recognition that life, with all its mundane routines, can also harbor depths of pain and loss that defy easy explanation. Max, sensing the shift in the air, rested his head on his lap as if to offer silent comfort. The dog's calm, steady presence was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of our existence, there can be a quiet, steadfast hope. As dawn began to filter through the narrow window, soft light illuminating the battered edges of the metal box and the scattered remnants of a long-forgotten past, he sat in reflective silence. The oppressive weight of the previous nights had lightened, replaced by an understanding that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by the removal of every shadow, but by the compassionate acceptance of life's inherent imperfections. The apartment was no longer an arena for inexplicable dread, it had become a vessel for a story of loss, regret, and the bittersweet beauty of memory. He resolved to document the experience fully, not as a chronicle of supernatural terror, but as a testament to the fragile, poignant interplay between the ordinary and the extraordinary in human life. With measured strokes, he began to write his own account of the discovery, each word an act of both catharsis and remembrance. The narrative was honest and raw, a blend of vivid recollection and introspective sorrow, designed to honor the memory of the unknown soul whose secret had been unearthed by a dog's unwavering vigilance and a man's relentless pursuit of truth. In the final hours of that transformative night, as the apartment slowly shed the shadows of its past, he understood that the journey had forever altered him. The mystery had not brought forth a malevolent force to be vanquished, but had instead revealed the delicate interplay of human vulnerability and resilience. The corner that had once been a source of inexplicable terror now stood as a quiet monument to the power of memory and the enduring impact of lives once lived. And so, as morning light replaced the heavy darkness of night, he placed the metal box, now a repository of both grief and grace, back into its niche behind the wall. The sound of the building settling resumed its mundane cadence, and Max, ever faithful, curled up beside him in silent understanding. The apartment, with all its familiar imperfections, felt different now, not cleansed of its past, but enriched by the acceptance of its hidden truths. In that gentle, bittersweet moment, the man recognized that life's mysteries are not always to be feared or exorcised. Sometimes, they are to be embraced with compassion, a reminder that even in the most ordinary of settings, the echoes of our shared humanity can speak louder than any supernatural whisper. The weight of unresolved sorrow, once a source of crippling anxiety, had transformed into a quiet lesson in empathy and the enduring beauty of remembrance. The journey was over, yet its lessons would linger long after the echoes of that night faded away. The dog's steady gaze, the rhythm of tapping in the dark, and the hidden secrets of a crumbling wall had all converged to reveal a truth that was both devastating and redemptive, that the most profound horrors we face are often those etched into the human heart, and that in facing them, we find not only our vulnerability, but also our capacity to heal. As he rose to greet the new day, a sense of solemn peace settled over him, the testament to the quiet power of acceptance, and a reminder that sometimes, the greatest courage lies in the willingness to confront the past and to allow its shadows to illuminate the path toward a more honest, compassionate future.